Fellas, it's time to do some UFC Awards for 2024. So I've got multiple different categories on this list, and I'm going to be picking a runner-up and then eventually a winner for each of the categories on this list to kind of do some UFC Awards, just so we can have a bit of a recap of the year that we've had in the UFC in 2024. And we'll go straight in there with the first category, which is Knockout of the Year. Who do I think has had the best knockout in the UFC in 2024? The first runner-up is going to be Alex Pereira knocking out Jiri Prochazka at UFC 303. Yeah, the reason why this was one of my favorite knockouts this year is it kind of got rid of the competition between the two of them, because obviously their first fight ended prematurely, or at least that's what a lot of people thought, where Pereira knocked him out, but a lot of people thought Jiri was fine. And then the second fight starts, the pre-octagon stare down before, one of the greatest stare downs in UFC, probably the greatest stare down in UFC history. And then Alex Pereira, right at the end of the first round, drops him with a massive left hook, pretty much knocks him out with 0 seconds left, so Jiri has enough time to recover at the end of the round, saved by the bell. Second round starts, 3 seconds into the second round, Alex Pereira hits a disgusting leg kick on Jiri Prochazka, knocks him out cold, just 6 seconds into the second round. And yeah, I think just everything about this knockout, the fact that Porton settled the score between him and Jiri, I think it's definitely his best knockout this year. The way that he practically knocked out Jiri twice in a single fight. The only reason Jiri survived the first knockout was because of the bell. But yeah, I think this was an amazing knockout from Porton. Left hook and a head kick in the same fight. Yeah, great knockout, one of the best ones this year, main event of a pay-per-view, and it was on short notice as well. We were originally weren't even going to see this fight, but because obviously McGregor pulled out, we ended up seeing it. So Pereira knocking out Jiri Prochazka at UFC 303 is, in my opinion, the first runner-up. The second runner-up for best knockout of the year is going to be Sharipute Magomedov knocking out Armen Petrosian at UFC 308. This was a really good kickboxing match before the knockout. It was actually quite competitive. It wasn't like Sharo was necessarily dominating. Petrosian was having his moments. And then in that second round, just before there's 10 seconds left, Sharo perfectly sets up a spinning back fist, defended by Armen Petrosian, just to return the other way with another spinning back fist. And this time it knocks out Armen Petrosian. The first ever double spinning back fist knockout in UFC history. While there's 10 seconds to go at the second round, I think is one of the best knockouts. Perfectly set up from Sharo Magomedov. And I think this was massive for Sharo Magomedov's career as well, because previous to this knockout, a lot of people kind of critiquing him, saying that he's struggling to get past these cans like Makal and Antonio Tricoli, and then he fights Armen Petrosian, a seasoned kickboxer, and knocks him out with like one of the best knockouts this year with a double spinning back fist knockout of the night, knockout of the year, whatever you want to say. In my opinion, one of the best knockouts I've seen this year, just because of how unique it was, and it fits Sharo's style so perfectly of being crafty. But then my winner for the best knockout this year, I think it's got to be the obvious one, Max Holloway knocking out Justin Gaethje at UFC 300. I mean, just everything about this fight. 10 seconds left after a 5-round scrap. Holloway points to the middle. They both just start brawling. Perfect like BMF title fight right there. Holloway lands a perfect shot on Justin Gaethje, slumps him when there's 1 second to go at the end of the round. The fact that it was on such a big occasion of UFC 300, the fact that Holloway was in the lead and he gave Justin Gaethje a chance at the end to throw down, I think is like the BMF move from Max Holloway. So Max Holloway knocking out Justin Gaethje, everything about it, the occasion, the way the knockout was set, the fact there was only 1 second left, everything about this knockout I think was perfect. And I'd go as far to say, you could say this is one of the greatest KOs, if not the greatest KO in UFC history, not just of the year. So Max Holloway knocking out Justin Gaethje at UFC 300, moment of the year, knockout of the year, whatever you want to say. I'm putting that as the winner for the best knockout of 2024 in the UFC. The next category is going to be fight of the year. Who's had the best fight? This isn't necessarily the best knockout, the best performance. This is just what has been the most enjoyable fight to watch. You know, an absolute scrap this year. The first runner-up is going to be a title fight between Islam Makhachev and Dustin Poirier at UFC 302. I didn't expect this to be a fight of the year contender. I thought Makhachev was going to go out there and finish Poirier pretty quickly, but that wasn't the case. They just started brawling on the feet. Obviously, Makhachev did a lot of success with their takedowns, taking Poirier down a lot of the time as well. But Poirier had solid takedown defense, but they were both just kind of trading back and forth on the feet. Dustin Poirier doing Dustin Poirier things with the boxing. Makhachev surprising everyone with an insane stand-up where he's actually landed a lot of shots on Dustin Poirier. Fair enough, it might have been a threat of the takedown, but he was still doing it. And then to end it off with a cherry on top, gets the submission over Dustin Poirier in the 5th round to secure the finish. But I just think this fight had everything. The anticipation, because everyone was excited to see Poirier get his title shot. I remember everyone was hyped up to see it against the best in the world in Makhachev. The fact that it was actually a really fun fight to see. They were both just trading back and forth on the feet. Makhachev impressed everybody with his stand-up. Poirier impressed everyone with how long he was able to survive. And then it ended in a finish with Makhachev submitting Dustin Poirier, as we all expected it to happen. But yeah, Makhachev Poirier, probably one of my favorite title fights this year, which is good because it was on a terrible card. But Makhachev Poirier, first runner-up for fight of the year. The next one, I'm going to go with UFC 308, Mateusz Rebecki versus Mitabek Robai. I'd say this is probably the most brutal fight I've seen this year. I think it's safe to say we're probably not going to be seeing Orobai for like another 6 months. This was such a brutal fight. So the fight starts off, and pretty much the entire fight is just them trading back and forth on the feet. Rembetsky landing powerful shots on Orobai, credit to Orobai's chin, Orobai landing back as well, until eventually that third round specifically, where Orobai gets dropped by Rembetsky. Rembetsky's like hitting him with ground and pound for like 2 minutes straight. It was like 2 minutes of just straight ground and pound. Orobai slowly gets up, still receiving ground and pound, gets on top position, then starts raining ground and pound on Rembetsky, making a massive comeback. I just think this fight had everything. I think Orobai's probably come closest to getting finished out of every fight this year. He was about a second or two away from getting finished against Rembetsky. It was violent, it was bloody, it was back and forth. I remember in that third round when there was like a minute left, they both looked like they had absolutely nothing left, but they just kept swinging. Rembetsky versus Orobai, probably the most brutal fight I've seen this year, and I think it's definitely a fight of the year contender. Mitabek Orobai, like I said, probably not going to be in the octagon for ages because of the amount of damage he took in this fight, but it was violent. It's everything you could possibly want in a fight. Rembetsky and Orobai is my second runner-up for fight of the year, but my winner for fight of the year, it's going to be Daniel Zelibu versus Esteban Ribovics at UFC 306. Before the third round, I'll talk about the third round, which I'd make a case to say is one of the greatest rounds in UFC history. But leading up to that third round, it was a good fight. You had Ribovics, landing a lot of shots on Zelibu landing back. It was just a very back and forth fight on the feet, a nice little scrap. Nothing crazy, but just a nice little scrap. Same thing in the second round. They were both just trading, landing some massive shots on each other. Then in that third round, Zelibu hits Ribovics with a massive elbow, drops him, nearly gets the finish, and then in that third round again, Ribovics hits a massive right hand on Zelibu, and then again, it just against the cage, unloading on Zelibu for like 2 minutes straight, a minute and a half straight, nearly gets the finish. Zelibu answers back. Then at the end of that third round, when we all thought Zelibu was about to be done, he lands back on Esteban Ribovics, gets a massive shot on Ribovics. This fight just had everything. A massive comeback from Zelibu, obviously still lost the fight, but it was a nice scrap for 2 rounds, and then you thought Ribovics was going to get finished in the third. Then we thought Zelibu was going to get finished. Then he answered back against Ribovics. It just had everything in the you could possibly want in a fight. And I'd say the third round between Zelibu and Ribovics, it's arguably the greatest round one of the greatest rounds in UFC history. The fact that there was 2 knockdowns, and they both got so close to getting finished. It was just a back and forth scrap. You couldn't look at a single 10 seconds throughout this entire fight where there wasn't a significant strike thrown. So Zelibu versus Ribovics, in my opinion, will go down in history. Definitely the best fight we've seen in 2024. And it was definitely the best fight on obviously 306 as well. Next category, Fighter of the Year. My first runner-up for Fighter of the Year is Joaquin Buckley. I actually think he's definitely a contender for being Fighter of the Year. This year, he's had 4 wins, 3 of them coming by way of knockout. I know one was a doctor stoppage, but still counts as a TKO. And he went from being unranked. I remember coming into this year, he was kind of just known as being this journeyman, unranked, and then he's ended off the year being number 6, one of the top contenders in the welterweight division. Starts off the year by finishing Vicente Luque as a massive underdog. Goes to the UFC 300 press conference. Calls to be on UFC St. Louis. Gets the fight on UFC St. Louis, but they give him a killer in Ruziboyev. Beats Ruziboyev again as an underdog. Then he knocks out Stephen Wonderboy Thompson for the first time since Anthony Pettis knocked him out at UFC 307. Comes back in a Fight Night main event a couple of months later against Colby Covington in Colby Covington's comeback, and just bullied Colby the entire fight. And obviously got the finish by doctor stoppage. Buckley, in my opinion, is definitely a solid runner-up for Fighter of the Year. Obviously, he didn't fight for a belt, and he hasn't really beaten it. Not all of his wins have been against top competition, but I mean, finishing Wonderboy Thompson, finishing Luque, finishing Colby Covington, and beating Ruziboyev all in the same year, turning his career around. One of the most improved fighters of the year. I'm going to say Buckley, definitely a contender for being one of the best fighters this year, just because of how he's turned his career around. The second runner-up, I'm going to go with Ilia Topuria. Again, another fighter that has completely made an name for himself this year. Coming into this year, he wasn't a champion, wasn't even on the pound-for-pound list at all. Fights Volkanovski for the belt, and at this time, Volk was undefeated in the featherweight division. Volk had never been beaten at featherweight, so Topuria had a big task on his hands. Goes out there, knocks out Alexander Volkanovski in the second round. First guy to knock out Volk in the featherweight division. First guy to beat Volk in the featherweight division. Takes his belt. Then he fights Max Holloway, a guy that has never been KO'd in his entire MMA career, and he breaks another record as well, being the first guy to knock out Max Holloway, and he's just become a complete superstar, one of the biggest stars in UFC right now. He's pound for pound top 5 as well. There's so many super fights on the horizon for Ilia Topuria. What he's done this year in just 2 fights by beating, like, imagine telling someone back in 2022 when Volk and Holloway were running the UFC that there was going to be a guy to knock them both out, stay undefeated. Like, you couldn't have written a better career for Ilia Topuria. It's like a textbook perfect career, and obviously the biggest success took place in 2024. So another runner-up is Ilia Topuria, but the winner of Fighter of the Year is, the one who everyone's talking about, Alex Pereira. You can't really deny what Poton's done in 2024. 3 wins, all of those wins coming by way of finish and knockout. 3 title defenses as well. 2 cards saved with UFC 300 and UFC 303, but he's just had a great year. Headlines the biggest card in UFC history at UFC 300 against Jamal Hill. And at this time, Jamal Hill, I know a lot of people clowning him, but he was on a winning streak of just 3 finishes and a win of a Glover Teixeira. He was a former champion who vacated the belt. And he goes out there, has a memorable knockout where obviously Jamal Hill hits him into the groin shot, waves back the ref, and then goes for the left hook and knocks out Jamal Hill in a satisfying knockout, at least nowadays. Then he saves UFC 303, or he was supposed to be McGregor versus Chandler, saves the card on short notice against Irabraska, and like we said earlier, delivers one of the best knockouts of 2024 against Iri. And then he faces Khalil Roundtree, where a lot of people like surprised that Roundtree was getting this fight, but he definitely delivered. It was an absolute scrap between the two of them until eventually Porton in that 4th round just got in the matrix, entered the zone, broke down Khalil Roundtree, and got the finish. He's had a great year. I mean, he was already a big star before 2024 because of his fights with Adesanya and the fact that he was still a champion coming into 2024, but 3 title defenses, 3 finishes. He's completely put the light heavyweight division on hold. Man, he's achieved that, like saving 2 cards as well with 303 and 300. Alex Pereira, in my opinion, has to be fighter of the year because of what he's done. And he's beat top competition as well. Jamal Hill, Khalil Roundtree, Yuri. Beating all 3 of them by way of finishing the same year is crazy. So, Alex Pereira, in my opinion, fighter of the year for 2024. And then for debut of the year, who is debuted in the UFC from a different organization and has had one of the best years you could possibly ask for in a debut. The first runner-up I've gone for is Felipe Lima. Felipe Lima was an octagon champion coming into 2024, which is like a massive promotion outside the UFC in like Europe. Fights on short notice against Mohamed Naimov, and most people thought Naimov was going to win. He was on a winning streak, undefeated in the UFC, and it looked like he was a big contender, well, a big prospect in the featherweight division. And he takes down Mohamed Naimov in that 3rd round and gets the submission, gets a massive upset victory. And then he's scheduled to fight Miles Johns, who had taken a few losses here and there, but was, you know, he had an upward trajectory career. Fights Miles Johns, gets the win against Miles Johns at UFC Tampa, and now he's probably going to be fighting in the rankings in his next fight in the featherweight division. So I think Felipe Lima's had a great UFC debut this year, submitting Naimov and beating Miles Johns, securing that ranking fight. I think is amazing for Felipe Lima to debut, especially when no one really expected him to even beat Naimov when he came over to the UFC. The next runner-up for fighter of the year, or for debut of the year, is going to be Mauricio Hufe. Probably the biggest, or one of the biggest lightweight prospects right now in the UFC. Obviously from the Fighting Nerds, which is one of the most growing, or a gym that's kind of got a lot of hype around it, a gym that's grown a lot of killers in the UFC. Debuts against Jamie Malarkey in Brazil in his hometown at UFC 301, and he just completely styled on Jamie Malarkey. This was one of the best debuts you could ask for. Completely styled on him in Brazil, broke him down, and then eventually got the finish in that 1st round when there was like 30 seconds left. Then he fights James Lontop at UFC 309 on the main card of a pay-per-view, and his only 2nd fight in the UFC in the same thing. Even more styling, just completely battering and styling on James Lontop for the entirety of the fight. Credit for James Lontop for being so tough, but Mauricio Hufe got the win, beat James Lontop, and you could, like I said, you couldn't have asked for a better debut. Battering James Lontop, styling on Jamie Malarkey. One is a headline, one is a main card for a pay-per-view. One of them is in Brazil, your home country. So Mauricio Hufe, I'm going to say, is another debut of the year, and now he's one of the biggest lightweight prospects. But I'm going to say the winner for the best debut of 2024 is Kayla Harrison. Now, Kayla Harrison wasn't a complete nobody coming into the year. A lot of people knew her for being an Olympic gold medalist in judo. She had obviously fought in PFL before, which is a big MMA organization. She debuts at UFC 300 against Holly Holm, which is quite a tough fight to debut against in your UFC debut, especially on such a big card. But the fact that she did it at UFC 300 and completely manhandled Holly Holm, just took her down, ragdolled her, and got the submission in the 1st round by dominant fashion, and basically stamped her name into the UFC. Great debut for Kayla Harrison at UFC 300 by submitting Holly Holm. Then she fights Ketlin Vieira. It wasn't as dominant as the Holly Holm fight, but it was still dominant, but she didn't get the finish super early on, but she still kind of made it so it wasn't really a close fight. Went out there and mauled Ketlin Vieira for the entirety of the fight, got back in the Willing column, and now she's probably going to be fighting for a belt against Juliana Pena in the next fight. So I'm going to say Kayla Harrison, I'd say she's probably the winner of debut of the year. I think she's had the best debut this year. Fighting for a belt on her next fight, 2 solid wins, 1 solid finish on the biggest card you could have asked for. I mean, debuting on UFC 300 alone just says everything you need to know about a debut that you're having. So I'm going to say that Kayla Harrison has had the best debut of 2024. And then the upset of the year, where we all thought the fight was going to go a different way. The fighter that no one expected to win ends up pulling off a win, however that may be. The first runner-up for the upset of the year is Dan Hooker versus Mateus Gamrot. I don't think anyone really expected Dan Hooker to win this fight. On Tapology, at least, most people were leaning towards Gamrot winning this, and rightfully so. Gamrot, apart from a loss to Dariush, he was just beating everyone. You know, he'd beaten Faziev, I know it was a bit of an injury, beat the Santos, beat Turner, beat Sarukian by a close decision. And Dan Hooker, even though he was on a 2-fight winning streak, it was a close split decision to Jalin Turner and Claudio Puelles, and before that had lost 4 of his last 5, and he'd been inactive since July of 2023. Everyone thought Gamrot was going to win. He thought it was going to be a boring fight where Gamrot kind of just out-wrestles him and gets a decision win, but that wasn't the case. It was a scrap between the two of them. Dan Hooker did a lot better than people think. Gamrot still went with the wrestling, but Dan Hooker did a lot better than people thought with at least a takedown defense. Was just firing shots on the feet, got the win in Perth at UFC 305, and Dan Hooker got a win. I don't think anyone expected Dan Hooker to be back in the top 5 of the lightweight division after beating Gamrot, but he did. Massive win for Dan Hooker, and I'd say one of the biggest upsets this year, especially when Gamrot was supposed to fight Makachev at UFC 294 when Oliveira pulled out, and he was originally meant to be the original backup. For Gamrot to get beaten by Dan Hooker, massive upset win for Dan Hooker. The next one is going to be Anthony Smith versus Vitor Petrino. Yeah, this was a huge, if you look at the betting odds leading up to this fight, I think it was the biggest betting favourite on the UFC 301 was Vitor Petrino. Nobody gave Anthony Smith a chance, and, you know, Vitor Petrino was undefeated. Most of his wins coming by way of finish. This absolute powerhouse in the UFC who was running through everyone. Knockout power, submission ability, grappling ability against Anthony Smith, who had lost 3 of his last 4. Got knocked out by Khalil Roundtree, finished by Ankalaev, and lost to Johnny Walker. And you look at the comments on the announcement post. Everyone thought that Smith was going to get beaten by Petrino. No one thought that Petrino was going to lose to Anthony Smith of all people. Fight starts. Petrino shoots a dodgy takedown, gets caught in a guillotine, and Anthony Smith somehow gets a submission of Vitor Petrino and pulls off a finish. I still think that had he not gone for that takedown, he probably would have got the win over Anthony Smith somehow, but I'm not taking away the win from Smith. It was a huge upset. Nobody thought Smith was going to go to Brazil and beat Vitor Petrino. This entire fight was made pretty much to push Vitor Petrino, get him that big name, get him in the ranking spot, and get him a top 10 fight after this. No one was really taking into account the fact that Anthony Smith could even win this fight. No one saw it as a possibility. So for Smith to get the submission over Vitor Petrino, just shows a veteran against a guy who's on the come up, and how impressive that is for Smith. Fair play, massive upset. Next runner up for upset the winner for upset of the year I've gone is Neil Magny versus Mike Malott. Right at the beginning of the year, UFC 297. Yeah, again, Malott was a huge favorite going into this, and rightfully so. I mean, they put him on the main card. I think he was the featured fight for UFC 297 in one of his first fights in the UFC in Canada, because the UFC were desperately trying to make a next big Canadian star. He was 4-0 in the UFC, I guess if you count the Contender Series. All of those coming by way of finish. He had great submission ability, great knockout power against Neil Magny, who's a bit of a win-loss fighter, wasn't really winning on a consistent basis, wasn't even able to beat the top competition. Everyone thought Mike Malott was going to beat Neil Magny. No one was really giving Neil Magny a chance, and after dominating Neil Magny for the entirety of the fight, the dude just decides to give up and gives Neil Magny a free win. Magny finishes him with ground and pound and gets back in the middle column in Canada. So Neil Magny finishing Mike Malott at UFC 297, when if Mike Malott would have survived like an extra 20 seconds, he would have won that fight. I'm going to say is the biggest upset this year, because no one really saw it coming. Even if you're going to pick Neil Magny to win, you don't pick him to win by finish. You might pick him to win by like a close decision, but for Neil Magny to be the guy to finish and beat Mike Malott in Canada, nobody saw that coming. I'm going to say that's the biggest upset of the year. Then we've got Robbery of the Year, where the fight went in the complete different direction to what it should have gone. The first runner-up for Robbery of the Year, I've gone for Rinat Fakhretdinov versus Carlos Leal. Yeah, this was a huge robbery at UFC 308, and it kicked off the card, which was so bad about this. Now, Rinat Fakhretdinov coming into this fight, it was supposed to be a mismatch. He'd had 4 wins in the UFC and a draw. He was winning fights consistently. Carlos Leal was making his UFC debut on short notice against Rinat, this big welterweight star. And it wasn't the case in the fight. Carlos Leal was able to defend nearly every takedown from Rinat. Rinat wasn't able to take down Carlos Leal. And on the feet, Leal was basically piecing up Rinat Fakhretdinov for the majority of the fight. Walking forward, landing shots on Rinat, outlanding him for the majority of the fight. And even in that third round, he was able to take down Rinat Fakhretdinov and get dominant position with the grappling. I still don't see a world where Rinat Fakhretdinov won this fight. It was a huge robbery. And like I said, it didn't set the tone right for UFC 308, because this was the first fight on the card. So you can only imagine that we thought this was going to be a consistent kind of thing that took place on UFC 308. But yeah, I still don't see how Rinat won this fight. I thought Carlos Leal won a comfortable unanimous decision, but he got the Abu Dhabi privileges. Rinat Fakhretdinov got another robbery win, and Rinat's had a lot of robbery wins. The fight with Nicolas Dalby was very controversial. He had a draw with Zaleska de Santos. Rinat keeps having these close fights on a consistent basis, and you find a debuting in Carlos Leal. I thought Leal comfortably won this fight, so I'm going to say that's one of the first big robberies of the year. The next one is Sean Woodson versus Alex Caceres. Maybe it wasn't as big as a robbery as Carlos Leal and Faguino, but I still think this was a big robbery. Alex Caceres was just outlanding Woodson the entire fight. There's nothing crazy that went on in this fight. It was just Alex Caceres going in, landing the better shots against Sean Woodson. Every time Sean Woodson would fire back, Alex would be out of range. Alex Caceres was just landing from round 1 to round 3 on Sean Woodson. I still don't see how Sean Woodson won this fight. I didn't think it was a complete domination from Alex Caceres. I don't think it was the biggest robbery of the year, but I still don't see a world where Sean Woodson wins this fight. I've watched this back multiple times. I thought Caceres did enough to win this fight against Sean Woodson. I thought he landed more. I think you look at the statistics, he was doing better in the statistics too, and just everything about this fight, I just don't see how Sean Woodson got the win. So Woodson versus Caceres, I'm going to say, is another runner-up for robbery of the year. But the winner, the biggest robbery of 2024, you already know what's coming. Ciryl Gane versus Alexander Volkov 2. One of the biggest robberies in UFC history, straight up. Round 1 takes place. The round starts off with Volkov taking down Gane, getting some control time, and then eventually Gane takes down Volkov, gets some control time. They both kind of do a bit of back and forth on the feet. Volkov ends up on top position at the end of the first round. It could have gone either way, could round 1. I'd have probably given it to Ciryl Gane. Could have gone either way. Round 2 starts. And this is where Volkov was, I'm not going to say piecing him up, but I'd say Volkov definitely did the better on the feet. He had the better moment with that spinning back fist that kind of wobbled Ciryl Gane, and he was just kind of doing the better on the feet against Ciryl Gane. Gane couldn't really have anything to answer when it came on the feet against Volkov, so I think Volkov definitely won round 2. And then round 3 was out of question. Volkov's round. He had top position the entirety of the round. Wasn't really doing much with the position that he had. Volkov was on bottom position, kind of holding onto a Kimura that he never got. But because of the position that Volkov had in the control time as well, I thought he won the fight. Even Gane didn't think he won the fight at the end of that third round. And then for him to get his hand raised, I still don't see what the judges were thinking. I mean, he had Adelaide Bird, who was judging the fight, who is one of the most notorious notoriously one of the worst judges in combat sports history. But yeah, Gane and Volkov, the best you could have given to Gane is a win in round 1. He didn't win round 2. He definitely didn't win round 3. 2 and 3 was Volkov. The first one could have gone either way. So the best you could have done is a first round to Ciryl Gane and the other 2 for Volkov. I still don't see how the judges scored this for Ciryl Gane, especially in that second round where Volkov was piecing him up and landed and had the better moment with wobbling Ciryl Gane. So I think this was the biggest robbery of 2024. Gane, Volkov, huge robbery. And then the worst fight of the year, basically the opposite of the fight of the year, the fight that took place that I wish we could just rewatch. I wish this fight never took place. It was the worst fight to watch of 2024. First runner-up is Mario Batista versus Jose Aldo. Mario Batista, from this fight alone, has single-handedly become one of the most hated fighters in UFC history, and he hasn't even had to say anything. It was just holding Aldo against the cage. You've got an opportunity to fight a legend in Jose Aldo, and it was just him holding him against the cage. There's nothing more to say about it. It was just Aldo getting held up against the cage by Mario Batista, and then Mario Batista cruises to a decision victory. That's the fight. There's nothing more I can really say. And since then, Mario Batista has become one of the most hated fighters in the UFC just because of that. I mean, you've got an opportunity to fight a legend in Aldo, and I'm not saying you need to go and have a scrap with him or anything like that. Obviously, impose your game plan, but when your entire game plan is just stolen against the fence, it is boring. There absolutely nothing went on. He wasn't really doing anything with against the fence. He wasn't landing some significant strikes. He was just simply holding him against the cage. They get separated, and immediately, about 20 seconds then, shot another takedown, got him against the cage, and that was the entire cycle and repeating for the entire fight. So I'm going to say that was one of the worst fights of the year. The next runner-up for worst fight of the year is Muhammad Mokaev versus Manel Kape. Now, what made this fight so irritating to watch was the fact that this had such a good build-up. They were fighting in the hotel before the fight, even at the weigh-in, still trying to get at each other. Even 10 seconds before they were going to fight, they had to be separated by security because they were trying to run at each other. And then the fight starts, and you'd assume that they were like super close friends rather than being in a rivalry. They do absolutely nothing. It's a staring contest. Neither of them knew anything significant on the feet. It wasn't like an amazing Manel Kape performance on the feet. Muhammad Mokaev couldn't really get going. They was just staring at each other for the majority of the fight. Nothing went on for 3 rounds. Nothing significant happened apart from Muhammad Mokaev pulling down Manel Kape's pants. Nothing really took place in this fight. And it was super disappointing to see because of the rivalry that they had. The crowd were hyped. We thought it was going to be a banger. And it was honestly one of the worst fights of 2024. Super forgettable. In fact, it wasn't even forgettable. It was memorable, but for the wrong reason. So, Mokaev versus Manel Kape is the runner-up for worst fight of the year. But the worst fight of the year, in my opinion, the winner of the worst fight of the year, is Raquel Pennington versus Mara Bueno Silva. Now, what made this one worse is not only that it was for a title and it was the co-main event, but it was the fact that it was 25 minutes long. We had to watch this fight for 25 minutes. I couldn't tell you a single significant moment that took place in this fight. It just felt like it was just, I know I've said this about Aldo and Batista, but holding against the cage. That's all it was. Hold it against the cage. Who can get the more control time against each other? Forget striking, forget damage, forget trying to win a fight. Who can hold each other against the cage for the longest? You look at the comments on the post as well. Everyone was kind of mocking it. And I remember one guy in the comments said he accidentally fell asleep to this fight. I nearly fell asleep to Pennington versus Juliana Pena, but this was even worse. So Pennington versus Mara Bueno Silva, it genuinely felt like something in the contract was telling them to see who can get the more control time, who can hold each other against the cage or hold each other and do no damage for the longest time. They weren't doing anything with the position that they had. For this to be a co-main event of a pay-per-view, 25 minutes long, I think this is the worst fight of the year. Pennington versus Bueno Silva, horrible fight. Anyway, the best pay-per-view card of the year. First runner-up, I'm going to go with UFC 308 in Abu Dhabi. This card had everything you could possibly want. Topuria making history by knocking out Max Holloway. Whittaker getting absolutely mauled and submitted by Khamzat Chimaev. Sharp Magomedov, like I said, with one of the best knockouts of 2024. That fight of the year contender, like I said, with Rumbetsky versus Orobai on this card. Ibo Aslan getting a finish in the first round. Abbas Magomedov getting that finish over Bruno Ferreira. This card just had everything. A ton of finishes throughout the card. A bunch of scraps. History-making performances from Chimaev and Topuria. One of the best. I mean, already coming into this card, it was one of the most stacked of the year. But sometimes we'll have it where a card will be really stacked, but it won't perform. This card did both. It was stacked on paper for a pay-per-view, and it definitely performed. I mean, most of the fights said they didn't way of finish. And that's not even to mention, you know, Lerone Murphy versus Dan Ige, which was a complete scrap as well. So, yeah, best pay-per-view of the year. First runner-up, UFC 308. The next runner-up, UFC 299. Some people even, I know that most people would put UFC 300 number one, which is the winner, but some people even think UFC 299 is one of the, like, the best pay-per-view of the year, and I don't really blame them too much for it, to be honest. I mean, look at the card. You had O'Malley battering Marlon Vera in the main event for the entirety of the fight. Dustin Poirier coming back and getting a knockout win, a feel-good win over Benoit Saint Denis. Curtis Blade shutting down the prospect of Jelton Almeida after what was a lackluster first round. MVP versus Kevin Holland. Rebellis Despain's UFC debut where he got a win. Michelle Pereira submitted Macau. This was a super stacked card. I was surprised that the UFC had a stacked card before UFC 300. I thought they'd maybe have a bunch of terrible pay-per-views to make up for the fact that 300 was so stacked, but this was, again, a card that was really stacked on paper and performed. And that's not even to mention Jack Della Maddalena versus Gilbert Burns, where JDM knocked out Burns after a scrap. Peter Yan getting back in the winning column, beating Song Yadong. This card had everything. Really good card. A bunch of fun fights. And if it wasn't like a 3 or 5 round scrap, it ended up being a knockout. So UFC 299, runner-up for one of the best pay-per-views of the year. But the winner, I'm not going to explain it now. It's got to be UFC 300. It's the most stacked card in UFC history, and it's definitely, in my opinion, the greatest card in UFC history. To open up the card with Figueiredo and Garbrandt, Bobby Green, Jim Miller, even the early prelims, honestly, I wouldn't be mad if the early prelims for this card was like that you took a couple of those fights and put it on like a pay-per-view main card nowadays. It's the most stacked card in UFC history. We're never getting a card like it. Max Holloway versus Gaethje, Pereira versus Hill, Oliveira versus Sarukian, Yurian Rakic, the UFC debut of Kayla Harrison, Yusuf Law. That's just every single fight, apart from maybe Jessica Andrade and Marina Rodriguez, and Aljamain Sterling and Calvin Cater. There's something to take from every single one of these fights, so UFC 300, without a doubt, is the best pay-per-view of the year. Now, the best fight night card of the year, the first runner-up, UFC Saudi Arabia. This was a really good fight night. This is probably the most hyped I've been for a UFC fight night, to be fair. We had Whittaker knocking out Ikram Aliskerov. After Ikram Aliskerov got a huge step up in competition. Alexander Volkov getting Alexander Volkov completely piecing up Sergey Pavlovich, proving that maybe Pavlovich wasn't as good as we thought. Sharon Magomedov knocking out Antonio Tricoli. An absolute scrap between Nasrat Haqparast and Jared Gordon. Volkan Oezdemir putting Johnny Walker to sleep. This was really good for a fight night. I know the UFC kind of go out for Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabian fight nights for the oil money, but this was really good. Nearly every single one of these fights were a scrap. So many good finishes without the card. I think UFC Saudi Arabia was the first runner-up, one of the best fight nights this year. The second fight night, I'm going to go with UFC Macau in China. So a lot of people put this as their number one. I did a poll on the community tab the other day, and most people putting UFC Macau as number one. Now, even though I won't put it as number one, I'm definitely going to put it as number two as the runner-up for the best fight night this year. This was a really good fight night. You had Peter Yan and Davison Figueiredo, which was probably the most high-level non-title fight we've had in the UFC, at least in 2024. We had Muslim Salikov get a KO of the year contender, at least one of the best knockouts this year, by getting a spinning wheel kick against Song Kenan. We had a massive comeback from Fernandez when she beat Wang Kong, and a massive comeback win. We had Zhang Mingyang get a huge knockout over Ozzy Diaz and get an 18 and another first round finish. That dude's got 18 finishes, all come by way of first round finish, and he got another one in UFC Macau. And that's not even to bring up the other knockouts on the prelims, like Ming Shi, when he got that head kick knockout over Feng, and it was one of the most brutal knockouts of the year. So UFC Macau definitely delivered. One of the best fight nights this year, if not the best fight night this year. And I hope we go there again. But the number one fight night to me is the most recent one. Call it recency bias, say what you want. But I think UFC Tampa, the last card of 2024, was actually the best fight night that took place this year. We had Buckley bullying Colby Covington, absolutely beating the crap out of him in Colby Covington's comeback to the UFC, which was satisfying to see. We had Cub Swanson and Billy Quarantillo have an absolute scrap until Cub Swanson absolutely folded Billy like a lawn chair. We had Manel Kape have a performance of the year contender against Bruno Silva, where he was just mocking him the entire fight in the zone and then eventually finishes him. We had Dustin Jacoby get a shocking knockout win over Vitor Petrino, which nobody saw coming. We had Michael Johnson get a brutal knockout over Azetar as well in the prelims. We had Yoel Alvarez get another finish once again against Drakkar Klose. We had Sean Woodson get a knockout. Nearly every single one of the fights that took place on this card was a knockout. There was only, I think, 3 fights on this card, 3 or 4 fights that went to a decision. Every single one of them, apart from that, was by way of knockout. You couldn't have asked for a better fight night. A good crowd, a solid stacked fight night card. Most of the fights ending by way of finish. This was, in my opinion, the best fight night card of 2024. Definitely better than some of the pay-per-views we've had this year as well. Like, you're trying to tell me that UFC 302 or UFC 297 is better than UFC Tampa? Definitely not. UFC Tampa, stacked, performed, best fight night of 2024. Next category, Octagon Interview of the Year, post-fight speech of the year, where a fighter has won a fight, rocked the microphone, and had one of the best speeches. The first runner-up I've got is Renato Moicano at UFC 300. Now, obviously, he had that massive comeback win over Jalin Turner, gets the interview with Joe Rogan, and completely makes a name for himself. Asking for the bonus, asked Joe Rogan to be on the podcast as well, his new podcast of the after the UFC 300, and he completely rocked the crowd. And I'd say Moicano's probably made a name for himself because of these post-fight speeches. Like, obviously, he's fairly like a fun fighter to see, and he's a big personality on social media, but I think if Moicano didn't have these post-fight speeches, he wouldn't be anywhere near as big of a star as he is. So I think these post-fight speeches have genuinely like helped made Moicano's career, and I think the best one he's had so far is on a big card like UFC 300 after he finished Jalin Turner in a comeback win. The next Octagon Interview of the Year is Tom Aspinall at UFC 304, where he knocked out Curtis Blades, rocked the microphone after DC asked him, called out John Jones with the "Hello John," but it's kind of turned into a bit of a meme in the heavyweight division, well, not in the heavyweight division, but in the kind of, I guess, in the MMA community nowadays. But it was just such a polite call out from Tom Aspinall. No trash talk. DC's kind of egging him to talk about John Jones, and he politely calls out John Jones. The crowd go wild when he asks if they want to see Tom Aspinall versus John Jones. To do it in Manchester as well. Tom Aspinall's first like proper post-fight interview. I know he had one at UFC 295, but it was on short notice. Not a lot of people really knew who Aspinall was, but to do it at UFC 304 in Manchester, call out John Jones in a polite fashion after a first round finish, for the crowd to go wild. In my opinion, one of the best Octagon interviews of the year. But the best Octagon interview has to be Brian Battle at UFC Paris. Finished Kevin Gisette, the Frenchman, at UFC Paris, starts flipping off the crowd. The crowd are booing him. He's loving the boos. He's kind of winding up the crowd as well. Said that he wanted to keep booing him, and then he starts mocking France, saying that there's no way he's going to let a French dude beat him in a fist fight. And I think, again, Brian Battle kind of made a name for himself. I see more clips of Brian Battle's post-fight Octagon interview of UFC Paris than I do his actual in-Octagon fights. Not that he's necessarily a boring fighter, because his fight with Gisette was amazing to watch, but I think more people know Brian Battle because of this Octagon interview than his actual fight. So I'm going to say this is the best Octagon interview of the year. To go to Paris when they're all booing you, to troll the crowd, to mock them, to put it in their face that you just beat their boy, their prospect. I'm going to say that Brian Battle definitely has the best Octagon interview of the year. And by the way, Brian Battle's voice does not match his face. Like, with the way this dude sounds, you'd think he'd look like a Derek Lewis or like a Rosenstrike. You wouldn't think he'd look like a Brian Battle. He's got like a really, I'm not going to say it, but you know what I mean? Like, he's just got a weird voice for how he looks. Anyway, next category, biggest fraud check of the year, where we thought someone was going to do really well, and it turns out they're nowhere near as good as we thought they were. First runner-up in this video is Benoit Saint Denis. First big fraud check. Now, he was on a big winning streak, most of them coming by way of finish, 5 straight finishes. He was meant to be the next big thing in the lightweight division. I mean, according to Lucas Tracy, he was going to be the most dominant lightweight prospect we've ever seen. He's going to beat Dustin Poirier, future champion, whatever. Gets scheduled to fight Dustin Poirier while being number 12 ranked in the division, which just shows you how much hype this dude had to get a fight with a legend like Poirier while you're number 12. And he was actually a favourite, at least on Tapology. I don't know about the official odds, but on Tapology, more people thought Benoit Saint Denis was going to win than Dustin Poirier, which just shows the hype he had. He got chinned by Dustin Poirier, knocked out brutally by Dustin Poirier in the second round, and then he fights a main event in Paris against Renato Moicano. Again, a huge favourite is Benoit Saint Denis in this fight. Most people thought, you know, you lost to Dustin Poirier, you had staph infection, whatever, you're going to go out there and crush Moicano. Again, wasn't the case. Moicano mauls Benoit Saint Denis, mauls him with the grappling, takes him down, batters him so badly with ground and pound, the doctor had to stop it, and Moicano got the finish in front of France. And Benoit Saint Denis wasn't as good as we thought. Now, I don't think he's a complete bum. He looked good against Dustin Poirier in that first round, but you know, to get mauled by Renato Moicano, knocked out by Dustin Poirier, and now you're getting matched up against the likes of Paddy Pimblett as well, who I don't even know if he beats Paddy Pimblett these days. Massive fraud check. I thought this guy was going to be like a future top 5 fighter, future title contender, and now we don't even know if he's ranked potentially. His best win is Matt Frivola, so a runner-up for the first fraud check on this list is Benoit Saint Denis. The next runner-up for a fraud check on this list is Rebellis Despain. Remember, this guy had one of the quickest UFC careers and completely blew all the hype that he had. Now, he came into the UFC with a lot of hype, a bronze medalist in the Olympics for Taekwondo, and he'd mainly been hyped up because his last 3 fights before the UFC had all ended super quick. A 4-second knockout, a 3-second knockout, and a 12-second knockout. And he debuts against Josh Parisian, basically a can, and he knocks him out in, I think, 18 seconds, so he continues that streak of quick knockouts. Then he fights Waldo Cortes Acosta, and he gets completely exposed. He had absolutely no grappling. His stamina was non-existent. He was nowhere near as good as we thought he was going to be. Then we give him quite possibly the easiest possible fight he could have given him stylistically. Austin Lane, and he gets, again, mauled by Austin Lane, has no stamina, proves that he's not even good offensively. All he's good at doing is counter-punching guys that are coming in. When the other guys ain't coming in, the dude's got nothing to offer on the feet. He's not even a good kickboxer. Just imagine being a 6'7" Taekwondo bronze medalist in the Olympics, athletic, being a KO machine, and you can't even make it and have wins in the UFC's most uncompetitive division. That's kind of embarrassing in my opinion. So, Rebellis Despain, huge fraud check. I think he's now been signed to that GFL, that new MMA organization that hires like these old fighters, which just says everything you need to know about Despain. Came into the UFC's heavyweight's biggest prospect and got cut in the same year. But I'm going to say the winner for the biggest fraud check of the year is Vito Petrino. We talked about earlier of him having that massive upset win over Anthony Smith, but yeah, I had so much hope in Vito Petrino. I actually said that he's the biggest test for Alex Pereira outside of the rankings. I thought he was going to climb through the rankings. You know, he was this guy with knockout power, brutal on the feet, had recently improved his grappling. He had everything going for him. He fought Anthony Smith where, let's be honest, most people thought this was going to be a complete run through Smith. Smith submits him in the first round, but even then, a lot of people, including myself, were saying it's a fluke. You know, it was a fluke of a guillotine. He beat Smith 9 out of 10 times. Then he gets scheduled to fight Dustin Jacoby, where again he was a huge favourite. And he gets completely chinned by Dustin Jacoby. Gets knocked out cold by Dustin Jacoby. And now I don't even know how good he's like. I don't think he beats a Zhang Mingyang. I think an Umar Sy can beat him. He doesn't even look good in the Jacoby fight. He wasn't doing amazing on the feet. He couldn't get going with the grappling. He doesn't even look that good. So the biggest fraud check of the year, in my opinion, is Vito Petrino. But that is my MMA awards, or UFC awards, should I say, for the UFC in 2024. Let me know if I should have included any more categories and if you agree, disagree with the placements that I got on this list. Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.